As an indie game developer, chances are that you've wanted to make an online game at some point. Single-player games are great, but wouldn't it be so cool to play with your friends? Maybe you've tried, you did some research, got really excited, but then you hit a wall. It felt too complicated. Networking was confusing, or maybe people just flat out told you it would be too hard. If that sounds like you, then you're in the right place, because I ran into the exact same problem, but I pushed through and my game is officially online. So now, I'm here trying to make it a bit easier for other people than it was for me. I'm planning on making this into a 3-video series. We'll start with some basics that should be useful for everyone, but as the series progresses, we're going to dive into some specific examples using tools like Unity and netcode for game objects. These might fit your project perfectly, or they might not. What's important is that the concepts in these videos are going to be the same no matter what tools you use. Without further ado, let's get into some basics of networking. Well, what is a network? A network is a group of connected computers that communicate to share data. When networking for an indie game, you want to make sure you're only networking critical information. Things that are static, like your environment, probably don't need to be networked, but things that are dynamic and change, like the player characters or their movement, need to be networked so they sync up on all the players' screens. Now let's talk about 3 important terms. There's the server, the host, and the client. The server is exactly what it sounds like. Its job is to serve out information. A server is just a computer. When you connect to an online game in Minecraft, for example, you're connecting to a server which is responsible for dishing out information about the game, where the players are, and the state of the world. If your game might need matchmaking, or your servers are going to have around 10 or more players per game, you should probably look into a service that can host these servers for you. Now, if you're working on something smaller, where your players are just going to connect to each other, and you have maybe less than 10 or so players per game, you could have your players host their own servers. This is a really common solution in indie games, like in Peak, Rounds, or Jackbox games. It saves the cost and overhead of hosting servers, and it allows players to connect to their friends whenever they want. This brings us to our next term, the host. The host is both a server and a client. The host will have the same player experience as everybody else, but their computer is also running the server and serving all of the other players or clients in the background. We've introduced servers and hosts, so finally we can talk about the client. The client is just anyone who joins into a game or a server. They join an active server to play the game, and they request and send information to and from the server. When you move your player character as a client, you're sending information to the server so the server can update that for all of the other clients. Now we've talked about sending and receiving information. How does that even work? When you send data, your computer breaks it down into tiny pieces of information called packets, and it sends those packets consistently until the full message has been sent. The nice thing about the packets is that they're efficient and reliable. Instead of getting stuck in sending some large information, you're constantly transmitting messages bit by bit, and if any information gets lost, you only lose a little packet rather than the entire message. Now, why do you care? What does this mean for you as an indie developer? Your job is to make sure you're networking efficiently. You're in charge of making smart decisions about what data to include or exclude from networking. For example, one of the most constant pieces of data that you're probably going to be networking is player movement. So even the smallest optimizations, like only sending their position to the first decimal place instead of Unity's default of 5, could actually make a big difference in how much bandwidth you're using. These are the kind of steps in thinking that are not only necessary in networking, but also integral to minimizing latency and connection issues. So our last concept for this video is about whether to make something server or client authoritative. This is effectively who is in charge, who is the source of truth. So server authoritative means that the server is the source of truth and the clients just send their inputs. Server authoritative makes it much harder for players to cheat and keeps things really consistent, but it can introduce some latency and increases the load on the server. If you're working on a more competitive game or you have dedicated server computers, this might be the workflow that makes sense for you. Client authoritative means the clients are the source of truth. The client tells the server that they've moved or did something, and the server accepts it and lets the other clients know. This can feel much more responsive for clients, but it's easier for players to cheat. So if you're working on a smaller game or something less competitive, or you're using player hosting, this might actually be a better system for you. But also, most games actually use a mix of both. For example, the server might be in charge of game states, like whether the round is started or not, or whether you're in the main menus or an end scene. The server might be in charge of spawning things and scoring for players, while the client might be in charge of the player's movement or their UI. Alrighty, so congrats, you have officially learned about some extremely key fundamental networking concepts. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll try to get to them as I can.